the world's fastest growing humanitarian crisis, as thousands of Rohingya refugees are spending a fourth night stranded near the border with
Truly
Bangladesh.
horrific conditions described there. Now, foreign ministers from Malaysia, Thailand and Indonesia will be meeting tomorrow to discuss the refugee crisis ahead of a conference next week. But a director in the Myanmar president's office says that his country won't attend next week's
The state of
meeting if the
Myanmar
word
is facing
Rohingya is
condemnation
mentioned.
from
The
Muslims
Myanmar
over its
government
failure
does
to
not
stop
recognize
violence
the
against the
Rohingya
country's
as-
persecuted Rohingya religious minority. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Russia and other countries with a large Muslim population are among those protesting the years-long religious oppression in Myanmar. But the country's government claims it's only trying to establish peace in the country by fighting terrorists.
Following
the
claims that
reputation of
Rohingya
countries
militants were guilty of attacking police checkpoints there. More than 500,000 Rohingya Muslims have now fled across the border into Bangladesh.
We are living in a world where conflicts and wars are being part from our everyday lives. And some happen to live in them, while others only read about them. And due to modern technology of today, narratives and news around the corners of the world are easier to access, thus also easier to spread. And this also makes it harder for those reading the news to know who the real perpetrators are and who are the victims. Therefore, conflicts are also hard to fully understand and to get a peaceful solution to, as various narratives can be told of the story. And this is something we will bring up in this podcast regarding the group Rohingyas who are fleeing from Rakhine state in Myanmar today. And here we are, far away from the conflict in Rakhine state in Myanmar. 3 students been trying to understand what's been going on there, and regarding the history and the modern time, and yeah, but we can start by introducing ourselves.
Should I start? Well, to begin with, we are all students in the Peace and Conflict Studies program at Malmö Högskola. My name is Sabina.
And my name is Otto. When I asked some of my friends if they knew about the conflicts in Myanmar, specifically the one concerning the Rohingyas, it was interesting that not many knew anything about it. They were, however, familiar with other conflicts, such as the one in Syria or the conflict between Israel and Palestine. I have no idea why that is, but maybe it's because of the conflict's complexity, which means that it is, or that it can be both difficult to write a news article about it, but also to read one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I also think that it's because of the complexity of conflicts, which, yeah, I would say like every conflict is complex because you have to understand them in various directions. But then you also have like how hot is the news right now, how much does the audience want to read or see about this. I mean, like the news corporations, they have so much power and of what to be published and not, and they can just pick and choose. So I think that's also like a big cause of why we know about some conflicts and not, you know, in why some news are being more published and others not. That is another question to be asked maybe. Anyways, my name is Isabel. Yeah, and I totally agree with you on how little people know of Myanmar and the conflict in Rakhine state. For example, asked some people the other day just by saying, so what do you know of Myanmar? And I got the answer with a question, is it a band? But you can't really blame people for not knowing what really goes on in situations where, I mean, not even the actors themselves can agree of the situation. And we are constantly being fed with news of wars and conflicts every day. And us as students in this particular area, we actually have time to go into the understanding of them, or at least try. Whereas I think most people really rely on what is being said in the news, which is also, I think, the cause of different interpretations and perhaps misunderstandings of conflicts around the world.
Yeah, more and more people, world leaders and members of non-governmental organizations have begun to raise the question of whether or not there could be an actual genocide happening in Myanmar. Since the government of Myanmar, as well as the military, actively deny the fact that this could be a case of genocide or ethnic cleansing, there is a lot of pressure on those that watch from the outside to do something about the conflict.
Yeah, exactly. You have, for instance, Suu Kyi saying that it's not only the Muslim population that is the victims in this conflict, the Buddhist population are as well. While there are no denying that, it is the Muslim Rohingyas that has been left out of this Myanmar society for decades, even though they are said to have been living there for centuries. And the fact that they lost their citizenship in the 1980s also show how mistreated they are. I also think it's important to highlight that Suu Kyi did not speak out publicly about the conflict in Rakhine for a very long time, even though the world around her urged her to. Some, though, argue if her speaking out against the military will help the situation at all, since they hold 25% of the seats in the government and veto power over all constitutional changes.
Yeah, and I mean, basically, that she's denying the ethnic cleansing in Rakhine State is not really making her the most popular leader in the world today. We're gonna show you a clip now from the 6th of April 2017. It's with the Chancellor of Myanmar, Suu Kyi, being interviewed by BBC's correspondent Fergal Kane, and here he's basically asking her about the ethnic cleansing in Rakhine State, and here's what she has to say about that.
What happened was that in October there was these totally unexpected attacks on police outposts for no reason that we could think of, because we had started the citizenship verification process, we had started the process of trying to bring back people out of the IDP camps and resettle them. But of course the whole thing went awry because these attacks took place. And we have no idea why these attacks took place, but a lot of people prefer to ignore the fact that these had happened at all. Why?
I've been there myself on the ground on a number of occasions and interviewed people, and I would say I'm someone who recognises ethnic hatred and ethnic cleansing when I see it after Rwanda, after the Balkans. And maybe those attacks took place because there is a rising sense of frustration there, and that has fed into the hands of militants.
But as far as we could make out, at that time things were calm because people were waiting to see how we were going to go on with our development plans and with the nationality verification plans. But I just wondered whether those attacks were calculated to put a stop to this process.
Yeah, and so basically what we heard here was Suu Kyi denying the ethnic cleansing in Rakhine State and basically pointing her finger at the ARSA that is said to be behind this attack. They're not denying this either, but it's different stories behind why the attack happened. We're going to talk more about that later, but first, Otto, you had something to say about the history.
Yeah. Looking at Myanmar's history, and what is true as well about most of the world in general, history is violent. Aside from disputes between city-states in Myanmar, it has been invaded numerous times throughout history. Around the year 1300 it was invaded by the Mongols, and around the 1600s by Portugal, and by the British from 1840s to the 1950s. During the Second World War, the Japanese invaded Myanmar and fought the British, leaving the inhabitants with a difficult choice. Some fought for the British, while others fought for the Japanese. However, near the end of the war, the Japanese were losing, which led to the soldiers switching sides and eventually fighting the Japanese. But throughout the war, the British had used the scorched earth tactic, meaning that copper mines, oil wells and such were burned to the ground if it seemed probable that it could be captured by the Japanese. This meant that when the war ended in 1945, many of Myanmar's cities had been flattened out by bombs and shellings, and the people there had little means of using their resources, obtaining food and so on. Moreover, the war led to the collapse of the British administration in Myanmar, which meant that soon after the war ended, Myanmar gained its independence in the year 1948 and was finally free from foreign rule. However, Like so many countries with plenty of resources, those resources seem to have done more bad than good for the country.
But even though Myanmar is one of the richest countries in the world in regards to the resources, their income gap is one of the widest. The government exports a large amount of natural gas every year to China, which stands for 15 to 20% of their income. But they also have a lot of other resources such as rubies, sapphires and oil. However, from the information we have gathered, there is no evidence that this conflict is about resources, but the resources may be why countries, especially China, does not interfere since they risk of losing the imports if the military government fails.
Yeah, and I mean it's very important to have the history behind you when trying to map a conflict and to understand what is happening there as well. And that is also what makes this conflict and conflicts in itself very complex, because you need to try to understand where it all started and how has it been going on, and things that has been happening during the way of where we are today. But then we have the group of Rohingyas who has been haunted by the military for decades, but only now it seems that it started to reach our news feeds. Still it's hard to know what is really happening there because of the diffuse sides of the government and military denying that there is an ethnic cleansing going on in Rakhine state, and also because of the media and the outside world is prohibited to access Rakhine state and to actually be in there and to give out stories from inside.
Yeah, as both Isabel and Otto said, the conflict with the Rohingyas has been going on for a very, very long time. However, just this year, an event happened in Rakhine, which was the starting point of the latest wave of Rohingyas fleeing for their lives.
Yeah, and that is basically what this podcast wants to bring up. Why are the Rohingyas fleeing from Rakhine state, and how did it all start? Even though they have been oppressed for a long period of time, it seems quite recent that the conflict has started, due to what and how the media portrays it and in what amount. And what is said to be behind the Rohingyas fleeing from Rakhine state in Myanmar is the event in October 2016 when the Arakan Rohingya Solidarity Army, the so-called the ARSA, had been attacking 3 police outposts in northern Rakhine, killing 3 policemen. But here it also depends on what discourse you use, as for instance the government and the military use the words attack, while the group's leader of the ARSA, let me see if I can pronounce this right, Ataullah Abu Ammar Yununi. Well, he says, and I quote, for over 75 years there have been various crimes and atrocities committed against the Rohingya. That's why we carried out the October 9, 2016 attack, to send a message that if the violence is not stopped, we have the right to defend ourselves.
I also think it's interesting how when the first attack happened, the world condemned the attack carried out by the RSA. However, now the discourse of the conflict is focused on the Myanmar military and their actions instead. Another thought-provoking fact about the Muslims in Myanmar is the prohibition of them to enter the 2015 election in the country. This was because the National League for Democracy, the NLD, were afraid to be seen as a Muslim party, which is why no Muslims are currently sitting in the government. Also, self-identified Rohingyas were banned from the voting in the same election. It is also interesting as Suu Kyi has been seen as the face for the country for many years and have said that whether one is a citizen of Myanmar or not seen as a citizen but live there, they should all be treated the same way with the same rights. But since the new government was formed, I have found no confirmation that they are trying to revoke the laws set upon the Muslims of the country in terms of limiting the number of children they are allowed to have.
In my country, when the military comes, we leave everything at home and just run. I have seen them throw a baby into a blazing fire with my own eyes. I have also seen them throw a baby onto a hot corrugated roof of a burning hut and the baby was cut into pieces. They snatched a baby from a mother and threw it onto a burning fire.
Because Myanmar has refused access to human rights investigators, the current situation cannot yet be fully assessed, but the situation remains or seems a textbook example of ethnic cleansing.
The first clip was from an Al Jazeera documentary, a woman who had fled from Rakhine state, and the second clip was the UN rights chief Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein given a statement from September this year, 2017.
The UN Security Council are now discussing whether or not this is an actual genocide or an ethnic cleansing. One thing that makes the conflict so hard to map out is the fact that journalists, human rights advocates and more are prohibited to go into the Rakhine state. The information displayed in the media is mostly from witnesses who have fled the country. What we have learned, though, is that this is an ethnic cleansing. The difference between the two, ethnic cleansing and a genocide, is very important to remember.
Genocide is defined as the following: any act committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group by such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group.
So to shortly summarize, the end goal of a genocide is the complete destruction of a certain group of people. The end goal of an ethnic cleansing, on the other hand, is an expulsion or banishing a group out of a certain area.
And yet we have all of these definitions, we have leaders from the outside talking about that it's an ethnic cleansing going on, that it's genocide. Still, Suu Kyi is denying the fact what is going on in Rakhine state.
No, it's not ethnic cleansing. It's a new problem, and yet it's linked to old problems as well. I would like to make the point that there are many moderate Muslims in Burma who have been well integrated into our society, but these problems arose last year, and I think this is due to fear on both sides, and this is what the world needs to understand, that the fear is not just on the side of the Muslims but on the side of the Buddhists as well.
The border guard police targeted Rohingya women and children. They took them from their homes. They raped the women and tore their clothes.
The soldiers killed so many people. They burnt down every single house in our village. They didn't spare a single child. They killed everyone, old men and women and children. They killed them by cutting their throats. When they saw us, they opened fire.
Something to have in mind regarding conflicts in itself. We are calling this, for example, in Rakhine state a conflict, others genocide. But as John Paul Lederach says, he means that conflict is never a static phenomenon. He says it is expressive, dynamic and dialectical in nature. Rationally based, conflict is born in the world of human being and perception. It is constantly changed by ongoing human interaction, and it continuously changes the very people who give it life and the social environment in which it is born, evolves, and perhaps ends. Conflicts are born wherever there is some sort of social oppression, social injustice, human injustice, human violations. A conflict can be born out of resistance. And as the Myanmar government and military is trying to sustain their power, maybe The Rohingyas are just trying to survive. On behalf of Peace and Conflict Studies, we want to thank you for listening on this podcast regarding the Rohingyas fleeing from Rakhine state in Myanmar. Hopefully we have given you some new information. Maybe you didn't know so much about it, maybe you knew a little, maybe nothing. Anyways, we hope you had a interesting and worthwhile time while listening to this podcast. And just remember something that Albert Einstein said. Any fool can know. The point is to understand. Thank you for listening.